How's it going? This is MBTI Exposed, working with MBTI Rationals, and today we're going to be going over Jung's model of the psyche. There's 3 parts of this psyche, and we're going to be discussing how these attachments to this psyche can lead to potential problems down the road when it comes to development for the self. All right, so there's 3 parts of this self and this psyche that Jung talks about. And the 3 that we're going to talk about together right here: the persona, the consciousness, and the shadow. The first part is the persona. And Jung said that the persona is actually necessary for an individual to live in society. And obviously there's pros and cons to both. A pro would be, say you're at a grocery store and they make you wear a mask. Well, you have to wear that mask because that's policy and that's the ethical thing to do. But it can get really, really bad when somebody, an individual, thinks, hey, I'm going to always do the right thing and always get along with what society says because I don't want to be the individual. I don't want to explore my consciousness. And down the road, that can be a problem. As Jung said, the persona is nothing real. It's a compromise between the individual and society. That is the persona. It's not yourself. It is part of the self, but it's not actually yourself, as the consciousness and the shadow are. The true self is the shadow. And the shadow is where your dreams take place. They're expressions. The shadow is an expression of who you actually are. Here's an example of how to compare the persona to the self. Not this. What I mean by the self is your true self, your shadow, your unconscious self. Say there's a trend in society that says, hey, if you don't wear a black shirt, you wouldn't fit in, if that makes sense. But your unconscious self, what you actually like, you have an unconscious desire to wear these blue shirts, that is your unconscious. So guess what happens? You take off the black shirt and you walk away from your persona. You take off that black shirt and you walk away from the way society wants you to be. And you put on that blue shirt and you be yourself. You be your unconscious self and you embrace that self. You strip away your persona and detach yourself. That's Jung's process of individuation. Jung said that the process of individuation is necessary for the well-being of society. And what he means by this is, if you're too attached to your persona, you are actually easier to control by big, large governments and corporations together. Conformist societies consist mainly of people who over-identify with their persona. The way I perceive individuation is a caterpillar going up into a cocoon and coming out to being a butterfly. It is a full embracement of the self, of the 4 sides of the mind. It is a full embracement of this. It is full embracement of the persona and understanding where you are attached to it. It is in full embracement of your consciousness, and it is full embracement of what you truly desire and who you are within the shadow, within the metaphysical realm that speaks to you in dreams, numbers, and signs. The consciousness speaks to you in the concrete, and the persona speaks to you in ethics. It's acceptance and balance between the 3, especially self-acceptance. As we discussed previously, the persona is the first part in the Jungian model of the psyche, and it is necessary to get along with society. Going off of this model, right here, the next part in Jung's model of the psyche is the consciousness. And in 4 sides dynamic, which we'll talk about soon, it's also known as the ego. The next part, which is not on this sheet of paper actually, right here, it's called the animus. And the animus basically protects the consciousness, you, the ego, yourself, from the shadow. Anima is also known as the subconscious. If you are a female, it's known as the animus. And if you are a male, it's known as the anima. It is the most blissful part of you. It's when you're attacking your insecurities or your inferiors. It's when you feel inferior, but you conquer that fear. And this is the first step to individuation. is making sure you conquer your fears. Third part of the Jungian Psyche model is the shadow. The shadow is just as important as the consciousness. The consciousness basically bursts the anima in this case, but the shadow is just as important, if not more important, because the shadow connects us to the universe as itself. So you have the whole self right here. The persona is not part of the self. The persona is learned through society, learned through ethics. Now, if you look at these four sides, if you look at the natural flow of the way things are, you have the consciousness, which is your ego and who you know you are. Then you have the animus, is where your insecurity and your fear lies. And then protecting the consciousness, yourself, is actually the animus. The animus kind of orbits the consciousness in this way. It doesn't orbit it directly, but it protects the consciousness from the shadow itself. You have two parts of your shadow for the most part, according to the four sides dynamic. You have the shadow, which is also known as your unconscious, which we'll go over very soon. And then you have the deep shadow, which is known as your superego. So I discussed to you the natural flow of the psyche. Now, when you take a look at the persona, and when somebody in their consciousness identifies with their persona too much or too often, what happens is this. It gets bonded. And when your consciousness and who you actually are gets bonded to your persona and what you've learned, that is not good, because it'll then impede on your animus. Then it'll impede on your deep shadow. And what happens is this persona is being controlled by, guess what? Society. So, whatever society says is actually going to affect your shadow. And when it affects your shadow, it affects what you actually want and what you actually think, what you actually feel. It attacks your insecurities. It attacks who you are as a person. And it attacks all the spiritual realms of you. And society will now have direct control over who you are and what you think and what you feel. This is terrible, and I see this so often today in society. This is the definition of conformity itself. And this goes against Jung's individuation process. Now, let me illustrate this for you so you can see it on the board and exactly how this conformity will completely directly affect our psyche. So, you have the persona, which is learned, okay? And what happens is, this persona will then get attached to this consciousness, right? And now this consciousness is basically impeded and corrupt with this persona. And guess what? Now you lose your protection over your shadow, and your shadow eventually likes to take control. So what happens is you become extremely unhealthy and controlled by this persona. You lose your protection through the animus, and now, since everybody has a less identity of self and they're not individuals, it'll affect the shadow. As I said previously, it affects the shadow. And guess what happens? This now gets connected. And this persona, controlled by society, influences us directly. Since you have no self-identity, you have no consciousness, you have no protection over what you actually desire, and you try to suppress what you actually desire, and then you end up wanting it more and more and more, what happens is you live an unhappy, unsatisfying life. It's a mask that you find comfort in. And you don't find comfort in your persona at first, but once you get so used to living in your persona and being this person that society wants you to be, you find comfort in it. You think that you're actually safe in your persona because you're with the societal majority, you're with the societal masses, and you're not sticking out. You think you're safe, but you're actually not, because you have no control of who you actually are. If you want to break free, you have to follow Jung's process of individuation. And the first step, tackle that insecurity. Tackle what it is you're insecure. If you don't know what you're insecure of, we will be discussing that very soon. This is MBTI Exposed, working with MBTI Rationals. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something. Hit me up on Instagram. More content coming soon.